May God open our eyes to see, our ears to hear, and our hearts to love. Amen. At the assembly there were lay people and ministers, but the ministers could be divided into two groups. Those of us who were going to preach on Sunday and those who were going to have a bit of a holiday. I really wanted to be here with you, even though my voice is in a terrible condition. But for those of us who thought that we were going to be preaching, knew that we were going to be preaching on Sunday, there were some rather macabre conversations during the week about the lectionary readings and about the kind of connections you might draw from John the Baptist's head on a platter and the assembly's processes and decisions. But sometimes, in the midst of stressful situations, dark humour is called for. But it is a terrible story. A prophet is going to be hurt, a life taken, the body beheaded. A story in which there is no redemption, when life is ended and hope destroyed, because John had the guts to speak as a prophet, calling Herod to account for the abuse of his power, his moral failings, and as a result he was killed. And John seems to be haunting Herod, even though in prison he hears the echo of John's words through Jesus and his disciples. And Herod fears that Jesus is somehow back, and he needs evidence that the problem will be taken care of. The reading from Amos also speaks of prophet problems. The reading tells us of a small part of the ongoing conflict between Amos and the high priest Amaziah. The religious establishment is not happy with Amos's message, and they want him to disappear. Amos preached in a context of inequality and injustice in the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE. It was a good time economically, but the benefits of the good time were not being shared equally. The urban elites and the wealthy landowners were enjoying their luxury goods, while the rural poor suffered. Earlier, Amos had accused them. They sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. Economic injustice was Amos's central concern. God's deep concern for human injustice is expressed in Amos's language of judgment and threat. But God is not angry for the sake of being angry. God's anger is not in opposition to God's love. As the theologian James Cone wrote, most theological treatments of God's love fail to place the proper emphasis on God's wrath, suggesting that love is completely self-giving without any demand for obedience. And Cone reminded his readers that Bonhoeffer calls this cheap grace. God's love demands righteousness, and failures to hear God's call to justice and love cause God grief. Amos shows us that God is not indifferent to human suffering, oppression, and injustice. James Cone went on to write, "The wrath of God is the love of God in regard to the forces opposed to the liberation of the oppressed." For Amos, God's judgment, which is an idea that progressive Christians have often struggled with, God's judgment is a manifestation of relationship with a living God, a God of passion who cares deeply, a God who is affected by us as we are affected by God. In our time, Amos speaks to churches and social structures that are committed more to their institutional survival than to listening to the voices of people on the edge, voices that need to be heard. Amos's emphasis on systemic social injustice made him a favourite of Rev Dr Martin Luther King Jr. In his letter from Birmingham jail, King writes to a group of well-intentioned white pastors who really wanted racism and inequality to end. But he wrote to them because they had urged King not to act too quickly, not to push his agenda with urgency, and not to employ strategies of civil disobedience. And in response, Dr. King called for a strong, disturbing stand against injustice. He called for extremism. King wrote, "Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." And King said, "Was not Amos an extremist for injustice? Let justice roll down like the waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Amos, John the Baptist, Martin Luther King, all called for social and religious revolution, and all of them were met by resistance from social and religious authority. For us in the Uniting Church today, these texts are a searching call for self-reflection. When does our well-meaning comfort mask indifference? When does our lack of love and justice make our religious practice meaningless? How do the institutions that benefit us build barriers that block the deep rivers of injustice? So in light of reflection on these powerful texts, I want to share you just a little of what happened at the Uniting Church Assembly in Melbourne this week. While marriage was the subject of the awareness in much of the church and in the coverage that the Assembly received, there were many other important issues that were discussed, and we heard about some of those in our service a couple of weeks ago. We discussed and accepted statements about domestic violence, about the care of creation, about implementing the findings of the Royal Commission. And we discussed the issue of sovereignty for Indigenous peoples. So before I speak about marriage, I think that was the other thing that really moved me to love and respect the Uniting Church through that process. The Assembly affirmed that Aboriginal and Islander peoples are sovereign peoples in Australia. After consultation in the working groups, which is part of the lovely process and sometimes trying process of a Uniting Church Assembly, the wording was amended to expand the definition of sovereignty as, quote, the way in which First Peoples understand themselves to be the traditional custodians and owners of the land. And the proposal that was passed referred to the statement from the heart at Uluru, recognising that sovereignty is understood by First Peoples as a spiritual notion, reflecting the ancestral tie between the land and the First Peoples. I was impressed with the speakers, Stuart McMillan, who brought the proposal, and he pointed out that while in the preamble to the Constitution of the Uniting Church, it says that the First Peoples understand themselves to be sovereign. We needed to move to a place where as a whole church we could affirm this sovereignty. Dennis Karawa, who was a former chairperson of the Congress, also stretched us to understand the political dimensions of this claim. He said that the journey in the church had been a work in progress and a journey for us to be able to live comfortably within Australia, feeling neighbourly love in community. He said we are moving closer to this and that Congress has led the way on this journey, and Congress, through people like Dennis, continue to lead. But I was really impressed that he also said that we need to be in federal political life. We have Aboriginal leaders there already, but we need a voice to Parliament, directly elected by the First People. And he pointed out that we already have this in the Uniting Church with the collective voice of First Peoples in the councils that are elected by First Peoples. And so there was a sense that in the Uniting Church, making this statement and acknowledging the centrality of the partnership with Congress in our life, that we may have a place to stand to offer a moral voice to the nation on justice for First Peoples. I do want to say something about marriage too. And I want to share a little bit of the process, which is, at the end of the assembly, the result, which is something I want to affirm, is all that's shared really. But the process was incredibly hard, incredibly long, and incredibly involved, but I think a process that was worth going through. The Doctrine Working Group had brought to the Assembly Standing Committee a very comprehensive report, which many of you have looked at, and the Assembly Standing Committee took from the 4 options presented by that report, one that would change the understanding of marriage in the Uniting Church to being between 2 people instead of between a man and a woman. But there was also lovely theology in that report that added to our previous understandings of marriage that were contained in the statement that was made in 1997, which, as well as saying that marriage was between a man and a woman, also said lots of good things about the richness of marriage and what it has to offer families and church and society. But not so much about society, and I think that's what this report brought to us. It said that, so the proposal that came before us began with the claim that marriage is a gift God has given to humankind for the well-being of the whole human family. And then it went on to talk about the relationship between 2 people who live together in a lifelong union that is expressed in every part of their life, and people who in a situation where they can enrich and encourage one another through love and companionship. It talked about fruitfulness, not just in the sense of bearing children, but about a fruitful life in whatever way you are engaged with other generations, contributing to the well-being of society and strengthening the mission of the church. And another key part of the proposal was that ministers and Uniting Church authorised celebrants would be able to exercise freedom of conscience with regard to accepting requests to celebrate marriages, including what the church calls same-gender marriages, but it's marriages for LGBTI couples, according to the rights of the Uniting Church in Australia. So that proposal was introduced on Monday afternoon. The Assembly had begun on Sunday. On Tuesday, and people were offered an opportunity to ask questions, but not to enter into debate. At that stage, it became very apparent that there was a serious opposition to this, and that was expressed through numerous points of order that aggravated the incredible patience of the President, who I think disguised her aggravation very well. It was an incredibly challenging task for Deirdre Palmer to moderate the whole week of conversations, but she did beautifully. By Tuesday night, there was a strong feeling that members of the Assembly, before we went into working groups to discuss the marriage proposals, wanted to hear more voices, and so there was an opportunity for as many people as wanted to speak in 2 minutes, which is an incredibly short time, about why they supported or did not support this. So on Wednesday it went to working groups, which was a group of about 10 or 12 people. My group was wonderful. It was incredibly diverse. It was like a microcosm of the Uniting Church. There were 3 Pacific women, 2 older and 1 younger, and the 2 older ones were ministers. An Asian man who was 2nd generation, a pastor of a church in Melbourne, and a bunch of us Anglos of different ages, ministers and lay people, and 2 people who were seriously opposed to the proposal, 1 a young man and 1 an older man who was a minister. So we heard from one another, and at times it was very difficult to hear some of what was said, and it was challenging. Those groups all recorded their reactions, and it went to the facilitation group. I don't know how many groups there were, but there were 250 of us there altogether, so lots of groups, lots of feedback. And the facilitation group was another group to which I would like to give great credit, because they pulled all of this material together. And they came up with a new proposal at the end of that process by Wednesday, which was a mixture of the 1997 statement. So part one was just to repeat the current understanding of marriage, and part two was most of what was included in the Assembly Standing Committee proposal. And there was yet more debate and another attempt to have a conversation, another working group conversation, and other items of business were intersposed through that all through the time. I was really unhappy with the look of the combined proposal with the 97 statement and the new one, because I was afraid that it looked like two problems. One was that it looked like there were two different understandings of marriage for two groups within the Uniting Church. And the other one, that it really didn't express, by putting it like that, it didn't express all that we did in fact hold together as a church in our understanding of marriage. I thought it was divisive, unnecessarily divisive, and that the two versions were too different. So I came up with an amendment, I think on Thursday night, which I foreshadowed, which was to bring the wording together as much as possible, and then to have a second part which just said we vary our understanding to allow two beliefs about marriage, one being that marriage is between a man and a woman, and one that marriage is two people. It became clear that in conversations after that was still unacceptable, because opposite-sex marriage and same-sex marriage understandings were incorporated in one statement. So I didn't actually end up presenting the amendment in the form that I had foreshadowed it. But I talked to somebody, a minister from a quite conservative part of Queensland, who was open to conversation, and about the need to be able to express that in two statements. So together we worked on wording that would be one statement for opposite-sex marriage, for marriage between a man and a woman, and another one that would say two people, but everything else about them would be the same, and they were a blending of the old and the new. But by the time it got back to debate, it seemed that even that was not going to be acceptable to people who were holding to a deeply conservative and traditional understanding of marriage. They really, really wanted the 97 statement to be able to be included in this decision. And I felt some grief about that. But David Baker, who was the moderator of the Queensland Synod, with whom I have a good relationship, particularly after Daring, suggested that what we could do instead was to have the 97 statement as it was, and to have a second version of the 97 statement that used the language of two people and a couple instead of a man and a woman. So that was brought before the Assembly, and David moved it and I seconded it. And I had an opportunity to speak to it. And I really felt deeply conflicted about where we'd ended up, because it was so much less than what I had come to Assembly hoping for. So I just want to read you a little bit about what I said in seconding it. I said, I came to Assembly hoping we would fully embrace an inclusive understanding of marriage that was included in the report of the Working Group on Doctrine, and hoping that the proposal, beautifully crafted by the Standing Committee, would be agreed to by the Assembly. Referring to my first go at an amendment, I said, yesterday I expressed hope that we could say as much as we possibly can together, but that I now understand that it was imperative for some members of the Assembly that the 97 statement is maintained. And I expressed my gratefulness to the conversations I'd had with David Bush, who was one of the first minister I talked to, and David Baker. But I said that as imperative as it was for them to have the 97 statement, it was also imperative for other members of the Assembly that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and queer members of our church are able to be married with their friends and family in their communities of faith. I do not want to perpetuate the development of silos with understandings of marriage that differ beyond the issue of gender. I want it to be clear that the marriages of LGBTI people are not marriage B, but the same marriage that is gifted to us by God for love and life and liberation. And so I said I support the amendment because I believe that God wants us to continue to work together in this church in all our diversity. Though this is not what I hoped for, and far less than what I dream of, which is a church that will embrace the full equality of its lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex and transgender members in every area of its life, I believe that the proposal reflects where we are and affirms all that we do share together. And so the amendment became that amendment became the substantive piece of work that we engaged with as the Assembly through an incredibly complicated process with many speeches for and against, and some of the speeches against were really hard to listen to. And one of the parts of the Uniting Church process is that you get to a point at the end of all of those speeches, and when there is clearly from this show of cards and the consensus process not agreement and not willingness of people to stand aside from to form agreement. And so the next part of that is the question, do we need to decide now? And that was one of the most harrowing moments of the Assembly for me, because the threshold for that is very high. I can't now remember whether it's 66 or 75%. Eleni probably knows. I think it might be 75. It was really high. And it seemed to me at that point that the 25% of people who didn't want it would be able to stop the whole process. But it did pass the threshold, and that was harrowing. Then there were more speeches because the President wanted to give people more time to think before we actually went to a formal vote, which was going to be a secret ballot. And I have to say those speeches just got worse and worse. It was really pretty agonising to listen to. So there was a sombre mood when it came time to vote, and even in that time I really didn't know what was going to happen. There were also harrowing procedural discussions about what percentage of the Assembly would need to support the decision. The first person moved that we need to achieve a 75% threshold, and then then that wasn't passed, but then the motion that we would need 66%, 2/3 was passed. And so we waited while the votes were counted, and eventually heard the news that the President, Deirdre Palmer, announced that it had in fact passed, and that it had passed by a significant amount more than the required 2/3. It was, I think I sat there for the next 2 minutes sort of thinking, I wonder what procedural motion is coming next, and what else do we have to do? And then gradually it dawned on us that this had happened and this was possible. Well, everyone was very, very careful to respect the fact that there was diversity. And one of the things I really appreciated by doing that new expression of the proposal was that it allowed conservative people who would never bring themselves to celebrate marriage for a same-sex couple to support the proposal, because they believed that we were a church that could hold these different views together. And so the sacrifice of that wonderful language that we had at the beginning seemed to me to be worthwhile, and my enormous self-doubt about having moved this was somewhat relieved. And I was very grateful for the voices of those conservative people who stood in that kind of wilderness space where they know probably that they will get quite a lot of criticism, including David Baker, who will have to go back to Queensland and hold together some fairly passionate views on that. But that was the moment of hopefulness. And I thought about Amos after that, and thought about that Amos probably would have got a lot angrier in the Assembly than any of us got. But maybe the psychology of human beings in the 21st century is different, and maybe we have been touched by the Spirit of Jesus, who does remind us that we are to engage with love and with prayer, even for those whose expression seems to be hateful to who we are. And so I'm glad that we went and we spoke, and that we also expressed the hope, the vision that we hold on to for our church, and the vision that we believe is God's vision for a church of full justice and equality, for LGBTI people, for the migrant communities who have come into this church and finding their place to stand, for Indigenous people, for people who are survivors of abuse, for our fragile planet that needs our care and our commitment. So holding on to all of the dreams that were part of that assembly, I think now that I am back here, it is time to celebrate this thing that we have done together. And I'm so grateful for you as a community, for the love that you sent me out to the assembly with, and for the allies and friends I found at the assembly, for Claire's love for me, which included a card per day with a beautiful picture and a message to get me through. And the joy that I can come back here and be with you and know that we will be a place of welcome and inclusion and love, and there will be some really lovely weddings in the next few months. So thank you.